Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
NosferatuNacht by Corpse Child. For just over 15 years, Berkshire, England, in its bright and wondrous splendor, was the breeding ground for joy and cheer. Every year, the denizens of the city gathered around the center of the square to share the tales of the otherworldly, tales of goblins and elves, of wizards and witches, tales of heroism and valor. This particular holiday was known to them as Lore Night, the one time of the year where any patron, young and old, were invited to come from any and all countries and cultures in the world. Lore Night always began upon the setting sun and would seldom end until the rising dawn. Of course, food and the best of the freshly brewed ale were always anticipated on this night. Fresh killed and adeptly prepared game, accompanied by what would be compared to at least 2 full-grown fields of delicious crops. On select few occasions, it was said that even be music played as the tales of the larger-than-life were being told. The best aspect of Lore Night, according to most in Berkshire, was when one storyteller would subtly attempt to weave their tale in such a way that would attempt to outdo the other tales being told that night. For example, 2 years back, a young lad captivated all in attendance beyond all other with his tale of a fierce and virtuous warrior that would conquer beasts and dragons alike for the protection of his kingdom. Another tale that was applauded above all others one particular Lore Night was spoken by a Norwegian sailor who regaled his own account of encountering and defending his vessel against the wrath of the damnable Dragor. Until tonight, this tale was considered to be incontestable in its popularity among the commoners in Berkshire. This Lore Night, however, would shift the very history of Berkshire, forming an irrevocable crimson stain on its otherwise joyous visage. This year's Lore Night began like every year before. The excited and anxious storytellers began to amass in the center of the city, where at least 3 cords of dry logs lay neatly prepared for the token bonfire that would blaze bright throughout the night's festivities. Long tables of food and drink began being prepared. The market clerk, who always ran the meat and produce stand, was, as always had been from prior years on this night, at the forefront of preparing the holiday feast. On this occasion, however, he was determined to make this year's Lore Night feast bigger and more gluttonous than any before, and any to come. The timbermen of Berkshire began to double the size of the festive pyre as an insurance its continuous burning. It seemed that the commoners intended for this year's Lore Night to be the biggest and boldest of them all, as if it may be their last. And for many of them, this night would indeed be their very last. The setting sun saw the lighting of the festival pyre in the center of town. Many gasped in awe and excitement at the monumental height of the hungry, scorching flames, each tripling the height and overall size of the years before. At this, the mass hastily flocked to the tables adorned with the gratuitous feast. In C.A.B. Deed, the market clerk and those in his assistance had outdone themselves, for even upon the setting sun's last glimmer, many were still preoccupied with gorging themselves on the delectable meal, and were unable to tell their tales they had prepared all year for on this night. That is, except for one man. This man, in fact, declined silently to partake in the feast. No one saw him touch so much as even a single crumb from the bountiful buffet. One or two individuals approached him, attempting to extend warm invitations to join in the bountiful banquet. The stranger answered these advances with only a cold, stoic, and malignant stare. Upon witnessing this behavior from the stranger, many in the congregate mass began to feel the slight chill crawl up their spines as they observed the stranger lingering near the festive bonfire, whose heat began to grow so immensely as to be felt by all in the nearby vicinity. Even as the heat of the blaze intensified, however, the stranger wouldn't remove the long, dark, ashen-gray trench coat, whose collar was erected upwards as to conceal his face, only exposing the eyes under the brim of his pitch-black, wide-brimmed hat, as he stood so close to the pyre that the congregants began to wonder what kept him from being set ablaze himself. The features of the strangers, or rather lack thereof, became more pronounced. The muted stranger's eyes were covered in red, raging veins, giving them an appearance not wholly dissimilar to a rabid animal. The irises were as devoid of hue as the trench coat that concealed his features from view. In the center, however, the stranger's pupils were somehow even darker than the night sky above itself, as if looking into them would cause one to be stripped of their soul in a matter of mere seconds. In spite of the stranger's foreboding presence, the attending mass gathered around the towering inferno that was the festive pyre. As it was time for the night's tales to be told, however, despite the full year's time spent preparing for this very moment, none in attendance could remember what stories they came to tell. None, that is, except for the stranger, whose gaze still fixed on the dance of the large flames before them all. "So you've gathered here for stories, have you?" uttered a cracked, hoarse voice, as if the speech was performed under some sort of intense strain on the vocal cords. Though hoarse and strained the words were, every individual ear had perceived them. There was a clear stance of absolute certainty in everyone's mind that the voice was indeed that of the stranger who, until that very moment, remained distantly cold and completely mute. The sudden shift in the stranger's behavior caused the attending mass to take aback in shock. "I will share a story with you all, a story to make you realize the mistake you've all made, and have made for a generation now." At this statement, a dreadful chill overtook the wind's breeze, causing the patrons to shiver, despite the ever-blazing inferno before them. This abrupt change in temperature caused some to position themselves closer to the flames in a feeble attempt to try and find some semblance of warmth in the midst of suddenly chilling air, an attempt that proved futile, as if the very essence of the flames' natural heat had been taken away, leaving them to dance wildly about atop the festive pyre. The abrupt phenomena, coupled with the formerly mute and mysterious stranger's threatening and rather ominous statement, forced an air of unease and a jarring sense of dread to spread throughout the congregation. "None of you believe in entities in whose name you forge these tales of fiction from, effectively desecrating the respect and fear they were once due," None of the patrons in the present mass knew how to comprehend the mystery stranger's abrasive claims. Surely, they optimistically thought, this facade is nothing except a mere act as a tact for captivating the audience's attention. This was Lore Night, a night of fun and cheer and the regaling of folk legends of elder days and the tall tales molded by the machinations of eager imaginations. Not the grim and macabre as was implied by the stranger. The tale I tell you now is the story of my land from which I hail. Take special care to listen, for when penance comes upon you all, you may then know in your beating hearts and tortured souls the full extent of those who you and your mockeries have disgraced. This tale, the stranger began, remaining stiff as if he were a statue cut from marble or granite, with his unwaveringly menacing glare eternally fixed within the festive pyre's flames, begins with the priest of my native land, Father Dirkenshaw. You see, the father was a good man, a righteous man. Holy as he was, the wills and righteous ways of the God Most High blinded the good father to the dangerous arrogance of closing his mind to the powers beyond the grasp of even the Heavenly Father's might to contest. As the stranger continued his blasphemous, macabre narrative, a stench of decay and formaldehyde laced the air was breathed by the congregate audience, forcing more than many of them to begin to gag, while others attempted the banquet they enjoyed profusely from being emptied from their stomachs as the offensive odor continued to pollute the formerly fresh air. Father Dirkenshaw, the stranger continued, had no tolerance for any such aspect of life that was not anything deemed not of holy merit, as but mere illusion of deluded and perverted minds. Like all of you, the father conducted his life in this manner for many a generational cycle, blissfully ignorant of the forces that play beyond the sacred rites of the Christian faith. The flames began to shift color from the bright orange to an infernal red. All at once, the formerly lost heat returned twofold, forcing the patrons to profusely sweat. Beyond the mild physical discomfort, however, was an infernal terror that this, as well as the previous phenomena, must in some way or another be connected to the stranger. This collective agreed-upon conclusion was not voiced by any, however, so as to not draw any undesirable attention to themselves, as well as to feed their equally growing sense of morbid curiosity in hearing exactly where the stranger's story would go next. The stranger's eyes widened, further pronouncing their disturbing appearance. That is, he continued, his voice further distorted with each uttered word, until the arrival of a conjurer whose very nature could and did challenge the will of the church. No one knows where he wandered from, as no one could remember any interactions with him. They hadn't even known of his name. The surrounding darkness outside of the immediate radius of the bonfire began to crawl inward, close to the towering blaze, engulfing nearly all of the congregated patrons, leaving only a select few to be spared from the shadows by the ever-raging fire's light. Whimpers of terrified anxiety rose among them as they began to lose sight of each other in the encroaching void, whilst the stranger, still illuminated by the glow of the blaze, continued regaling them of his ghostly testament. The stranger began to finally undo the buttons of his trench coat, though not quite yet enough to expose any of his features, apart from his corpse-like eyes. You see, the conjurer wished to live in peace amongst the natives. The stranger continued. His cold, sinister gaze appears to cause the flames to dance more viciously upon the festive pyre than before. But his hunger and conflicting practices forced him into a life of cold solitude. He would spend his days in a blissful hibernation, and would walk the land under the moon's glow. That alone, while trivial and mysterious to the commoners, was not what caused them to shun him. It was his unnatural palate for living blood. It was at this very moment, when the now captive mass began to perceive what they could only describe to be the chilling laughter of a pack of hyenas who lost themselves in some sort of state of hysteria. Hearing these cackles, certain individuals found themselves grateful in an odd sort of way that the oppressive darkness that now nearly swallowed each and every individual had rendered them unable to see even so much as their hands in front of their face, lest they would be forced to envision whatever demonic beings that could produce such a noise. Despite the increasingly overwhelming urge to attempt flight from the morbid phenomenon occurred in the city center, none of the congregation could find within them the strength of will even to flee in fear. The stranger's ghoulish narrative continued, despite the infectious spreading dread among the mass, whom were now swallowed in entirety by the looming shadow. His taste, his lust for warm flesh blood could never be sated, for such is the existence of one such as he, always craving, never enough. However, in spite of his ravenous nature, he wished only peace to the village folk. For many years, he would live off the blood of the livestock. One night upon his awakening, the conjurer had spied upon a beautiful maiden, the most beautiful of any in the long recorded history of his lifetime to ever have and ever would walk these lands. The love birthed within him as had not been felt since his conception into this earth. The manic howls from deep within the looming shadows became louder, growing closer and more pronounced, much the same fashion as a flock of predators, encircling their helpless victims, allowing the venomous fear to cripple mind and body before gorging themselves upon the fresh pound of flesh. Screams and shrieks of fright rang out into the ever-persistent darkness as glints of maliciously ravenous eyes shone as crimson as that of the rubies encrusted within the trinkets of the maidens present in the horrific scene of unholy events. Having left with no conceivable alternative for escape the menacing darkness and whatever malevolent evils within, the mass began to congregate as close to the blazing festival pyre as was physically possible, yet still taking great care to space away from the stranger, as if wandering too close to his presence may see them afflicted by some nature of unsaintly power that he may possess. "What be thy lordly given name, sir, from the distant lands beyond?" she asked the mysterious conjurer. The stranger's narrative continued. To this the conjurer spoke to her the very name that reigns the utmost supremacy in the land that I hail. I, my sweet, delicate blossom, am Lord Vladimir Clavicus of the Eastern Kingdoms." The stranger roared the name aloud, causing the blaze to flare in an angry burst, and the deranged howls and cackles from within the consuming darkness to bark out into the open night, creeping ever closer to the center. As swiftly as his eyes could entrap her, her heart succumbed to his lustful whims. Many a night following, the proud Lord Clavicus would call her from her tower to meet him, purely for the consumption of her precious blood from her beautiful porcelain skin. It was said that Lord Clavicus' bite filled the maiden's heart with further desire for him, for each night she was said to have grown restless, impatient for her consort's return. At this, many within the congregation began to feel cold, petite hands softly caressing their bare flesh, as the cackles within the consuming void continued to advance upon them. Soft, inane whispers were heard by each individual in the ear, the captive mass almost appearing as a sensual in nature. The stranger, of whose damning glare never arrested from the ceaseless fury of the furious flames within the festive pyre, continued, whilst his voice further stripped away into the malicious rattle pyre hatred as his tale went on. Oh, her blood he did drink, drink and drink until she no longer answered her master's siren call. For many a night he'd searched for her, starving of the young mistress's blood, when he discovered the truth of her absence. For, after they had last met, the natives spoke against her to the ever-righteous Father Dirkenshaw, who, in all his holy practices, ruled her to the world, and the Holy Father above as a witch, a devil's familiar with their faith unwavering and their blind convictions. The distraught lord discovered that the maiden had been felled, like many a maiden caught victim to blind conviction, by a raging fire like this before you all now. Screams of inhuman agony deafened the congregation as the wild, untamed flames began to shape and form themselves into the form of a delicate young maiden. Just as soon as its fiery birth was complete, a blackened maw opened that released an agonized wail that invoked an unutterable pain and sorrow that blended with the presently potent fear within the mass that could not and would not waver. As the flames returned to their former state, unyielding in its enraged ferocity, the stranger began again, his ghastly vocals taking on an air of aggression. "Vengeance!" his inhuman voice barked. "Vengeance he swore to exact on those whose holy ways led them to commit this atrocity. Upon them in the cold night he came, many a morn following. The families would find more of their dear beloved gone in the night, only to be spies upon the succeeding dusk as one of the disciples of the Nosferatu, Lord Vladimir Clavicus. I condemn you all, you bleating sheep of the Lord," he roared to them, one full moon twilight. Damn you all whose faith blinds you to the wills extant beyond God's law. Your actions deemed righteous by your God because of your lack of vision and lack of control stripped me of what I held dear to me. For this, I declare that as long as I am bound to walk these lands with earthly feet, the setting sun on the night for every generation to come, myself and my dwellers of the night will come, any of whom we spy in their play. We shall strip away from you as you stripped her away from me. For this night will belong to us, the Nosferatu, the vampire I christen this very gravely dusk, along with every such that reoccurs on every century to come, as the NosferatuNacht, the vampire's night. And upon his declaration conclusion, the vampire, Lord Clavicus, began his dark campaign with sating his feral ire with the blood he spilled from the great priest, Father Dirkenshaw. Many perished at the wrath and burning ire for warm, innocent blood that night before the sun rose, warding him away until the next annual cycle awakened him, concluding in the same grotesque manner as before. The abysmal cacophony intensified to a deafening pitch, with only the stranger's ghoulish, rasping voice being able to distinguish separately. From that night and every Nosferatu night since, Lord Clavicus has walked on this cold night, sating his desire for blood on those that foolishly neglect to pay credence to his words. Upon the conclusion of the stranger's horrifying anecdote, the mad cackles of malice. My dear delicate blossom, I am Lord Vladimir Clavicus of the Eastern Kingdom, and tonight is Nosferatu night, the vampire night. At that chilling revelation, the blazing fire burst skyward defiantly into the air to illuminate the hordes of beasts that took residence in the lurking darkness only moments before, each and every one of them bearing their vicious fangs. For indeed, these were the disciples of the vampire Clavicus. No sooner than the first squeals of hysteria was let out, that the stranger, the vampire, Lord Clavicus, bared his own fangs, rolling his eyes back into his skull with pleasure as he clamped his jaws around the young maiden's neck, savoring every last amount of crimson he could take from her. As he rose from her, now stripped of life, the once furious flames abruptly ceased, shrouding the helpless man in complete darkness as the Nosferatu came upon them. Try as they might, none of the commoners could escape the inhuman and supernatural clutches of the scourging beasts as they were swept away and torn apart like a herd of lamb in the midst of the wolves' den from what must have been every direction in the impossible, looming darkness. No cries for mercy were heard or heeded when the sun rose that morning. Silence had laid its claim to Berkshire. All that remained of the events of the accursed night were the smoldering embers of the festive pyre, and the mutilated and ensanguinated remains of the lore night mass, now set to become eternally bound to the tradition of the NosferatuNacht. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.